Hi, this is Bill from the Snyder Group, and we're going to learn how to submit data from an HTML form to a Google Sheet using the Google Sheets API. I have 6 tabs open in my browser here. These are the resources I'll be using to work through this build. This is the form that we'll be submitting to publish data to the sheet. This page will authenticate access to the sheet using Google Open Authentication and capture our refresh token to use later. Here I'm signed into my Google Drive where we will create the sheet. This is the reference for the actual API call we're going to make to append data to the sheet. And this is the Google API Explorer where we'll test the API call before writing our own code. Now, before we get to the actual code involved, I'm going to walk through the steps required to enable and configure the Sheets API in the Google Developers Console. Any Google API project will follow these basic steps during setup, but I'm going to configure this project specifically for this task. Sign into Google and go to the Developers Console dashboard at console.developers.google.com/APIs/dashboard. First, you'll need to create a new project. Click the project nav in the top left. Click the plus sign in the window to create a project. Name your project and click Create. Now return to the project nav and select your project. We need to enable the API that we'd like to work with in this project. So click Enable API and search for the API you want to use. I'll type Sheets and then select the Google Sheets API from the results. Here you'll see a summary of what this API does. Go ahead and enable this API by clicking Enable at the top of the page. We need to create credentials in order to access this API, so let's click the Create Credentials link here. In this case, we'll be making a client-side API call using JavaScript, so we select Web Browser JavaScript. We need to be able to modify a sheet that belongs to a specific user, so here we select User Data and click the What Credentials Do I Need button. Since you could have multiple credentials for a project, choose a name that identifies the type of access that will be granted to this client. Under Authorized JavaScript Origins, add the domain where you will be making the API call from. And under Authorized Redirect URIs, add the page or pages that will handle your oAuth login and token requests. In this case, I have one page that handles these processes, and I'll enter that URL here. If you're not sure what your callback URL will be, you could always update this later. So go ahead and click Create Client ID. Choose the name that a user will see when they are asked to grant your application access to their account. In this project, you will essentially be granting access to one Google Sheet that you are the owner of, so you don't need to worry about the advanced options here. If you were building an application that would be used by the world, you'd want to include a privacy policy, terms of use, etc. Click Continue and click Done. Let's go ahead and create the sheet that we'll be updating. So go to your Google Drive and create a new sheet. Name it and create the column headers. For this task, we'll be submitting 3 fields to the sheet: first name, last name, and email. Now that our project is configured, the Sheets API is enabled, our oAuth credentials and the sheet have been created, let's test an API call using the API Explorer. It's a good idea to test with the Explorer before trying to write your code, so that you can confirm that all elements of the project and the request are configured properly. This way, when you begin writing your own API call, you can eliminate potential errors in the project setup from your debugging process. Go to the API Explorer at developers.google.com/APIs-Explorer. Locate the Google Sheets API and click to view the available methods. For this request, we're going to use sheets.spreadsheets.values.append. To complete this request, you'll need to include the spreadsheet ID for the sheet you want to write to. So retrieve the ID from the sheet URL. Paste it into the spreadsheet ID field. I'm also going to paste this ID to a text file for later. We'll need this in our code. Since we'll be appending a row to the existing data in the sheet, we can enter A1 as the range. Google will read data beginning from this cell and add your new data in the next empty row. You can read more about the optional fields for this request on your own, but we'll configure them like this. For include values in response, we'll set this to false. Insert data option set to insert rows. Response data time render option, serial number. Response value render option, formatted value. And value input option will be user entered. Now we need to create the body of the request. This is where we include the data we want to submit to the sheet. Click in the field and select major dimension from the property menu, then type rows in the field that appears alongside major dimension. We're telling Google that we want to append the data as rows in the sheet. Next, click the property menu and select values. Add the 3 values for the first name, last name, and email that you'd like to publish to the sheet. If you just want to test your request, you can click execute without oAuth. But to begin, we want to make sure that we have configured open authentication properly. So toggle authorize request using oAuth 2.0 to on. And in the window, select the OAuth 2 scopes required for this request. Since we're not making any changes to the drive, like creating and removing folders or files, the only scope we need is spreadsheets. Select this scope and click authorize. You could read more about scopes in the API documentation, but as a rule, we only want to request the scopes that we will be using in the application. Test the request by clicking authorize and execute, and scroll down to see the results. The content in the request section is valuable to your development. This outlines exactly the URL that you will post in your code and the structure of the JSON data you'll need to send. If your request was successful, you'll see a 200 status code in the response and some JSON outlining the results. We see in the update section that we updated the range A2 to C2 with 1 row, 3 columns, and 3 cells. Let's take a look at the sheet and we can see the new data. So now we're almost ready to write some code. To start, we'll need a few identifiers for a project in order to make these API calls. So return to the developers console, go to credentials, and click on the oAuth client ID that we created earlier. copy and paste the client ID and the client secret to your text file so you can access them later. Before we can make an API request, we need to grant access to the application to allow it to modify our sheet. We verify these permissions by supplying an access token each time we make a request. All of this is done using the Google oAuth API. Understanding authorization and tokens can be confusing at first. It's really outside the scope of this tutorial, but I will outline for you step by step my path through authorization, token creation, and token refresh. We're going to use PHP to make the authorization request and generate access and refresh tokens for us to use in our application. Let's review the tutorial Google oAuth callback.php file. First, we have 3 configuration values required to make the request. Paste this information into the script. After configuring these variables, we need to start with a simple check to see if code has been passed to the page via GET, and we'll see this in the URL. You'll see why we do this in just a minute, but when we don't have a code, we want to build and display a link to request one from the Google oAuth API. Request for Google Open Authentication codes will always be sent to this URL, https accounts.google.com/o/oauth2/auth. And we configure this URL with some parameters based on our project configuration, passing the redirect URL and client ID, as well as the response type. In this case, we're asking for an authorization code. The scope, we want to access to the spreadsheets method. The approval prompt and access type. In this case, because we need a refresh token included in the response, it's critical that we set the access type to offline in order to get the required result. Let's go ahead and view this page in our browser. When we click this link, Google will ask us if we want to allow access to this account. Note that you should be signed into the Google account that owns your spreadsheet at this point. If we choose to allow it, it will pass an authentication code back to the callback URL we specified in the request. So now you see that we're back to the callback page, but this time we have a code included as a GET in the URL. We also have an access token and a refresh token displayed on the screen. Let's copy the refresh token back to our text file for later, and then revisit the second half of our PHP script to see what happened here. Armed with the authorization code from Google, we then use curl to post the code, client ID, client secret, redirect URI, and grant type, which is authorization code, to the token API URL at https accounts.google.com/o/oauth2/token. We get a JSON encoded response that we use to extract the access token and refresh token that we displayed on screen. Now that we have our tokens, we can move to the form submission. I have 2 files here to work with. One contains the HTML form. The other is the JavaScript we'll use to make the Sheets API request. I've included the JavaScript file in the page header, along with a jQuery library that I'll use for some basic display changes. I typically prefer to work on the server side in PHP, but Actually, when we first built this integration, I was working in an environment where I was forced into a JavaScript solution. If you wanted to use PHP, you could follow the same logic that I'm using here, but with a form post and curl request instead of this AJAX method. Here we have a basic HTML form with 3 fields and a button. You'll notice we don't have an action on the form because we're not actually going to submit it to the server. Instead, our submit button just calls our JavaScript function on click. There are plenty of ways to manage this form submission. You can choose whatever method works for your project as long as it's able to pass the form field data to the API call. For this particular application, we're allowing a web page to write to a specified Google Sheet that we own. We want to be able to authorize this action one time and allow the users of the web page to continue to publish to the sheet. Looking at our JavaScript function, first we perform some very basic field validation to ensure that we have data in each field. I've chosen to create an array of form field names, loop through each one, and check the field value. If it's empty, we highlight the field in red. If it contains a value, we append it to an existing variable, comma separated and wrapped in quotes. We'll explain why in a moment. If all of our fields have values, we can proceed to the API call. If we look back at the API Explorer, we can see exactly what we need to submit for this API request, including the properly formed post URL and the JSON data. As we were validating our form fields, we were also building a list of their values and formatting them for JSON. So in our row variable, we actually have a string that looks like this. But we've got an extra comma on the end of the last value, so we'll use the slice function to just nip that comma off the end of the string. Now let's configure our IDs for the request, including the spreadsheet ID, client secret, and refresh token. Next, configure URL and data for the request. We can use the request we submitted through the API Explorer as a guide, plugging in our config variables and the form field data we saved to the row variable. So we're getting close, but we're not quite ready to make this request. When we authorized the application to use our spreadsheet, we received an access token. While we might be able to submit the request right now using the token, it's only valid for 1 hour. If your application is going to continue to accept these form submissions beyond that first hour, you're going to need a new token. So this is where the refresh token comes in. Instead of going back through the process of generating an authorization code, we're able to exchange our refresh token for a new access token by posting to the token API and including our client ID, client secret, refresh token, and setting the grant type to refresh_token. We then parse the JSON response and save our brand new access token to a variable to use in our final request. Now it's time to publish your form data to the sheet. We create another post request using the URL and the JSON data we created earlier, along with the new access token. A 200 status indicates a successful response from the API. So let's go ahead and test our application. We'll view the form and sheet side by side to see our data flow right into the sheet. So here we go, a moment of truth. And it works. This is just one of many methods available to interact with Google Sheets. This API can be useful for all kinds of development applications, so please explore the Google documentation to learn more about the Sheets API. If you're interested in working with us at the Snyder Group on your Google API project, visit us at www.snydergroupinc.com.